Why were you asking about the winning narrative? You're talking about Israel, aren't you?
I'm
Am
talking
I
about
right?
any narrative. When a major event happens, you'll quickly notice that there's a very similar emotional tone and a very similar narrative that is dispensed from the mainstream media, whether it's from the BBC or the New York Times. And I'm just wondering, why is there usually one dominant narrative for almost every major event?
Because the CIA knows what it wants us to believe globally, so that's why it has this dominant narrative. The BBC CEO used to be called the content controller, and that was so obvious what they were doing all along. So this content controller manages our expectations and manipulates our moods by quietening us down, especially during Christmas, where everything is supposed to be quiet and nice, and creating narratives of political parties. We're having a general election on the 4th of July, and basically the narrative is that the Tories are now unelectable. It's got to be Labour. It's got to be Labour. But it's been repeated many times over the decades, with a similar managing of our expectations.
And is the public just passive recipients of elite narratives, or does the public get to play a role in which narratives become dominant?
Well, they can choose to believe it or not believe it. And I think this dominant narrative is meant for the eyes and ears of the average female voter, who won't be interested in geopolitics, probably doesn't understand her own history very well, and certainly isn't interested in the histories of other countries the American empire invades. And what I've noticed about Ukraine was that Zelensky was chosen specially for his ability to appeal to a certain demographic, women of a certain age who think, he's got a full head of hair, he was a comedian, he's got a nice looking wife, that sort of thing. I mean,
And which narratives give you the biggest dopamine rush? Which narratives make you feel the greatest?
I want everything to end happily and for good to triumph over evil. I did want to ask you about Yuval Harari's book, *Sapiens*. Have you read that one?
No, I find him tiresome, and he just seems to relay the conventional wisdom as though it's some great big insight. So I just find myself tuning out whenever I listen to him speak. And I haven't read any reviews praising the book from people I respect. So
he seems to be saying something quite important, that people believe what they want to believe, and human history has been people making up stories about themselves and their group and living their lives to make it come true. The fake it till you make it strategy for people's preferred narrative. What do you think about that, Luke?
Yeah, I think people choose the narrative that makes them feel the best, that gives them the biggest dopamine rush, reduces the pain.
Stupid beliefs make clever people stupid. I was wondering if you had an answer to that question.
And we're all stupid in various areas. Like, nobody's going to be astute in all areas of life. And as we are going to be primarily attracted to those narratives that give us the biggest dopamine rush. Of course, many of them are going to be completely disconnected from reality. But if you embrace a narrative that's completely disconnected from reality and is rationally stupid, that doesn't mean it's a bad narrative for you, because many of our narratives have to do with things that have no direct impact on our life. So let's say you embrace a narrative about the causes of World War I that is completely disconnected from reality. That's not going to have any effect on your life. Let's say you embrace a narrative about UFOs that is disconnected from reality. That's not going to have any effect on your life. If you exchange one type of Christian theology for another type of Christian theology, it's not likely to make a dramatic difference in the quality of your life unless it changes the people that you hang out with, and then it's their their social influence that will change your life. So most narratives, most beliefs don't have any direct impact on someone's life.
What about religious beliefs, belief in the Abrahamic God? Because, well, they're supposed to be, all those people who claim to be Jews, Christians, and Muslims, so they're supposed to believe in God. But it's and you've pointed it out before that it doesn't. Even Jews, Christians, and Muslims do not behave in a way that is recognizably different to atheists.
Yeah, so the belief in and of itself doesn't make much of a difference in the lives of people who say yes to the belief, except it does make them a little more predisposed to more intense in-group identity. So what will make a difference is if that belief then leads to concrete human connections, and then those will form you, those will affect you. So if you believe in God in a Christian sense, and then this leads you to greater connection with Christians, then those social relationships will have some effect on you.
The overwhelming majority of people who claim to be Jews, Christians, and Muslims are atheists. So you join the Christian gang, or you join the Muslim gang, or you convert to Judaism, and it is really about which social club you want to belong to, rather than any principled belief at all.
I think we're living in a secular nationalist age. And as opposed to 600 years ago, when we lived in a much more religious world. So in this more secular, more nationalist age, this is going to affect how we engage in religion. And most people are not abstract thinkers. They're not going to think deeply on matters of theology or religious principle. And so their religious affiliation will affect them, primarily on the basis of identity and the personal connections that they make or fail to make. So if you go to a church and you don't have several friends there, you're going to abandon that church. On the other hand, if you go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque and you have half a dozen friends there, you're going to persist. And in all likelihood, if you attend frequently, those relationships are going to become among the most important in your life. And so you will protect them, and you will seek, in protecting those relationships, to conform your life, at least outwardly, to what your most important friends expect from you.
Yes, but on the subject of religious principles, or just any principle, aren't we, at the end of the day, logically supposed to say that we're prepared to die for our principles?
That's just not the way the world works. Very few people are willing to die for their principles. People are willing to die for their family or for their closest friends. So Americans who fought in World War II, they weren't primarily driven by ideology or by promoting democracy. They were primarily driven by their connection with the soldiers that they fought with. It was those relationships that were the primary thing that shapes them. And so too, with your typical Christian, Jew, and Muslim, they are primarily driven by their closest relationships. If those closest relationships come out of a house of worship or a religious schooling, then they're going to be incentivized to conform their behavior with that which will enable these relationships to keep going. But certainly in a overwhelmingly secular nationalist world, very few people would die for a principle, and it simply would be evolutionarily maladaptive. So not many of our ancestors were willing to die for principles, or we wouldn't be here. Like in a fight for survival and in a struggle for the fittest, all right, those people who are less willing to die for principle were more likely to propagate their genes than those who were willing to die for principle. So our ancestors are much more likely to be killers and rapists than they were to be people who died for principle. And so we've got the genetics of killers and rapists and liars much more than we've got the genetics of martyrs.
But these killers and rapists you mentioned, they surely die for the principle of patriotism when they are conscripted or expected to join in a war that will ultimately kill them.
They probably did everything they could to minimize their chance of dying. Few of them willingly went to their death because it just makes common sense genetically that our ancestors were more likely to be people who did everything that they rationally could to reduce their chance of dying and put more of a premium on reproduction than people who are going out there to die for any particular cause. People who willingly put themselves out there to die for a cause are much less likely to reproduce successfully than people who try to avoid dying.
But it's for the furtherance of the group. A quote from Thomas Jefferson comes to mind about the tree of liberty being watered with the blood of young men.
The blood of martyrs. It's one of those nice sounding quotes that can be quite inspiring, but I don't think it accords with reality. So most of our narratives probably don't accord with reality, and that's just another inspiring narrative that does not reflect reality. If our ancestors were dying for principle, we wouldn't be here. It's much more likely that our ancestors were people who did everything they could to minimize dying, including betraying their principles, and they were much more likely to be killers rather than be killed, and they were much more likely to be rapists than people who were extremely circumspect in their sexuality.
But Judaism has this principle of martyrdom, doesn't it? And it is called Kiddush Hashem?
All religious traditions, I would expect, have some tradition of martyrdom. That's inspiring. But there's a very big difference between having principles and narratives that extol martyrdom and then actually carrying it out. Now, there have been a tiny minority of Jews who are willing to die Kiddush Hashem and to die martyrs, but there wouldn't be Jews around if that was the general predisposition of Jews.
If Jews had been prepared to call out the idolatry of Christians, maybe Christianity would have been less global, perhaps. And perhaps if Muslims had been prepared to admonish those who claim that God has begotten a son, as commanded by the Quran in chapter 18, verse 4, I guess they might have saved themselves from Western imperialism.
Nobody listens to what outgroups have to say about your religion. I remember growing up as a Christian, the idea that the people around me gave a fig what Jews said about idolatry was just completely inconceivable. Nobody cared what anyone outside of their particular religion said. And so as a convert to Orthodox Judaism, no Orthodox Jew gives a fig what any non-Orthodox Jew says about God and religion, let alone what a Christian or a Muslim says. And so I can only imagine that for the overwhelming majority of Muslims, none of them give a fig nor look for guidance from Christians and Jews with regard to what's true. We're all overwhelmingly oriented to only listen to people who already share our narrative, who are already part of our in-group, and we are just predisposed to ignore the criticism of out-groups.
But liberalism is a religion, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a secularization of Protestantism. Like woke is a secularized type of Protestantism.
And it is based on atheism, which means people would be afraid to die for their principles and mock people who do die for their principles. But it makes me wonder how weak it makes atheists seem. If you can imagine a group of soldiers who are all atheists and a group of soldiers who believe in an afterlife and that good will be rewarded, then it seems to me that the soldiers believing in God and the afterlife would be more likely to fight more bravely and therefore be successful in battle.
In a technological age, the bravery of soldiers is rarely the decisive element in an engagement. What usually happens is the most technologically advanced, the most powerful armed forces wins over the less powerful armed forces, and the bravery of the individual combatant doesn't really have much to do with it. I mean, if one side has machine guns and the other side does not have machine guns, side with machine guns, I'm pretty sure won most